The groups, as it has been, is, and will forever be inevitable to happen, there are formed up groups that consist neither of one individual nor all together. The groups in such a way represent a valley between complete collectivism and complete individualism. This valley is reality. Struggles between groups that are neither individuals on their own nor everyone are the conflicts which have formed everyday life. Wars are fought between groups of people that are called nations or countries, especially as of late, groups of people based upon arbitrary physical characteristics such as race, ethnicity, or gender are quite commonly brought up. People seem to strive to identify themselves within certain groups. If not this, perhaps they will strive to identify themselves within a group which does not identify itself within a group, thus defeating their individual will. And the groups do not really exist, for each member is simply an individual with their own unique circumstances and methods of thought, which is why some consider stereotyping to be an issue, and why the decisions made by groups are flawed in their nature to all members involved. Stereotyping seems to be the creation of the ideal epitome of what a group is when perceived as an object. Of course, the stereotype, synthesized upon the uncertain grounds of irreality which is then further diffused by the unique interpretation of every thinker, is not a completely accurate picture of every member of the group, not to mention even one. The stereotype is a vague common denominator of the individuals who have given their own selves over to the group. As a result of this selling of the self to the group, members who have invested in the group will become confused, disillusioned, or distressed when they perceive or become aware that the group whereof they are a member is acting or seeming adverse to their preconception or individual interpretation thereof. A variation of the belief, the group is how I want to perceive it and want it to be, often manifests itself, which in some cases leads to the oft-championed fallacy of no true Scotsman. Example: for when a person who calls herself a feminist, who does not hate men by her own individual thoughts and framework, is asked why she hates men by some interlocutor who has his or her own individual perspective on what the word means, she will not only say that she does not hate men, but also she will say that feminists do not hate men because she does not, as a member of the group, and she will point her interlocutor to the appropriate sources having been built up to support her fervent faith in the idea, and will, having given her own self to that group, reassure herself that her own interpretation of the meaningless word and non-existent group is the correct one. That is, if she should by some means become acquainted with those who both cover themselves with the word feminism and hate men, she will proclaim that those are not the real feminists, aligning that word, which is used by many, to her own use and esteem thereof. It is important to note that the exact opposite of this scenario is just as plausible. That a female feminist who hates men should say that such a notion is proper by her own interpretation of the rules of the group whereof she is a member is no less able to occur. The example involving the different sets of rules based upon individual context and perception segues into the next result of there being no predefinition of what groups are supposed to be outside of each member's individual ideas on the topic, which is the flawed and imperfect effects and results produced by groups. Because all members involved possess different interpretations of the rules of the group based upon their ideas of what the group means for them, when the group should assemble to lay down some sort of order in writing or to compact upon some decision to be made, the group begins a heated debate unless there is appointed some incarnation of an authority on what the group is supposed to be, such as a leader or a visionary at all. When the group is able to arrive at a consensus, said consensus is a meaningless common denominator of all the members' individual and unique thoughts. In the case that some individuals are not represented at all, it is because they have laid down their own will and have been directed by the inane mass of the group. These two are situations of compromise. In the case that an authority or a singular individual has given without debate the matter to the other members of the group, those individuals have all become subjugated to the will of that person who has decided what their opinions of what the group is or ought to do are. In short, the groups serve to muddy the individual and commingle one's own will with that which is unrelated and irrelevant. It is unnecessary and destructive when the groups strive against one another because the individuals who claim to be a part of any groups really do not share any sort of commonality. There is nothing which unifies groups together other than the relative similarity between individuals. Example: for when the group whose members called themselves Americans broke away from the group which called themselves the British, with the war having been fought, and with many people troubled, not that they would not have been otherwise, the Americans then only turned to each other and became concerned not with the word American, outside of establishing the correct rules and a correct definition behind that term, dependent upon one's own interpretation thereof, but with the newly important words Federalist and Anti-Federalist. While this conflict was not in any way as violent as that of the division of the 13 colonies from the non-existent entity called Britain, the perpetual formation of groups from one supposedly unified groups is clear. Thus, within any group, there have always been the appropriate specifications and terminologies so that, as the threshold for the acceptable amount of relative similarity rises, the limit of the size of the group decreases to approach the individual level. Example: there are so many supposed genders which are proclaimed to be today by some, who give great names and give themselves also to groups based on simply promoting these ideas of grouping people together along arcane lines, that there will someday be around 300 million genders to match every person who exists in this country. Each individual who feels that they are different from the options maintained by some group endeavors to craft some other group based on their interpretation of themselves because they feel the unsustainable need to give themselves some name other than the one which pertains to their own self and hand themselves over to a meaningless group, which, provided that enough have heard of it and invest their own selves therein, will break up into other groups out of the same motivation of the one who started the original group. In these ways, groups operate to create reasons for other groups to tear them down, all in a struggle for some inane common goal which will always fall short of each individual's opinion thereof. Thank you for listening. If you have any thoughts, please put them down below.